Okay. Great, welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Russell Jensen. My Tlingit name is Shakaguk. I am a development officer here at Sealaska Heritage, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our lecture today. Sealaska Heritage is committed to providing accessible community programming, but none of it would be possible without the support of donors. You can contribute online to this lecture series or to other programs at sealaskaheritage.org/giving. Today, we are very honored to have Terri-Lynn Williams-Davidson, a Haida artist, musician, author, activist, lawyer, and student dedicated to the resurgence of Haida culture. Terri-Lynn will be sharing the meaning of Haida Title and the journey between the Haida Nation and the province of British Columbia in the signing of the historic Gaayhllxid Rising Tide Haida Lands Agreement. There will be an opportunity for questions at the end of the lecture. If you're here in person, please silence your cell phones at this time, and welcome our presenter. Thank you.
Gíihlagalgang hanudi chiaga, di Gaayhllxid waga, huyet di guringe Gíihlagalgang. My name is Terri-Lynn Williams-Davidson, and I'm from the Skidans Ravens clan, and I'm very happy to be here and to speak with you today. I'm going to begin by giving a background to the Rising Tide Agreement, and then talk about Haida Title laws and sacred responsibilities, before I look at Haida laws, ways of being, and cultural ways project that will inform the work coming out of the Rising Tide Agreement, and then leave some time for questions and discussion at the end. And I'll begin by making territorial acknowledgements and expressing gratitude to Sealaska for the invitation to be here today. I want to acknowledge the Auk, Kwan, and Aku Kwan on the territory that we stand upon. I appreciate you taking care of this land so that we can be with you here today. I come from the territory of Haida Gwaii, the islands of Haida Gwaii, where most of my work takes place. I have an office, and I'm grateful to live and work on the territory of the Semiahmoo First Nation, which is just north of the border at Blaine. I'll begin because I don't know many of you. I'm from another country, and I'll situate who I am and who my people are. I come from the village of Gíihlagalgang. That's where I grew up. This is the village as you'll see it in 1878 in the beautiful photos of our villages taken by George Dawson. And then there's a picture of my village as it existed when I grew up as a child in the village of Gíihlagalgang. Very different village and different feel, but a very small community of less than 500 people. My father was a fisherman. He was a singer. He went to residential school. He was a very kind man. He was very shy and impacted by the whole colonial experience. He served in the Second World War for Canada. And I was greatly inspired by him to advance my education and to experience my voice that I inherited from him, as well as from my mother's side. My father was Godfrey Williams, my mother was Mabel Williams, and she was a true joker and an entertainer. She's here in front of the longhouse that the Haida erected at Lyle Island, and it's a painting that Robert Davidson contributed to the effort, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then she's wearing some goofy goggles because I was sad to leave her to go back to school, and so she put on these goggles to make me laugh, and that really was the kind of person that she was. And her grandmother is someone who has greatly inspired me. Her name was Susan Williams. That was her last married name. And she died in 1975. She was 109 years old. And she was the song custodian for the village of Gíihlagalgang. She kept alive songs for all the different clans in the southern part of Haida Gwaii. And I loved her very much. I only knew her for a few years of my life. The photo on the bottom is the last time that the people in Skidegate were allowed to put on our regalia and go to potlatch. We were discouraged from doing so by the missionaries, but also by the potlatch prohibition that was in place in Canada. So we were allowed to put on our regalia one more time, and my great-grandmother is sitting in the front row, the third from the left. She was a very traditional woman, but yet she also, like many of our peoples, walked a fine line between the colonial experience and traditions. And she's seen here looking very English in a formal blouse with 4 of her children. She had 13 children, and my grandmother, her daughter, had 13 children. So I'm related to everyone in the village of Skidegate. And I had to go to Masset to get married. My father's father was the chief of Skidegate, the chief of my village. His name was Louis Collinson. He was a carver of argillite. He was a very shy man. My father was not raised by him. My father was raised by his aunt, and he was sent to residential school because his mother died when he was 3 months old. My father's father, played in a brass band, as well as my mother's father, Jimmy Jones. He's shown here with my grandmother, Jatsquan Sarah Price. As explained, I have a variety of different mediums that I work in. I love to come back to Juneau. There's a photo here of dancing at Celebration, dancing the headdress with Rainbow Creek dancers. I recently engaged on an art project and wrote the book Out of Concealment, which led to Magical Beings 2 series to bring supernatural beings into classrooms and into the children's experience. I've released 3 albums. I'm releasing 2 more in the next 6 months, and I'm a lawyer, and that's what I'll mostly be speaking about today. I'm going to talk about the beautiful islands of Haida Gwaii. This is an image of Haida Gwaii from space. And I'll talk about the laws and sacred responsibilities that come from the islands of Haida Gwaii. In 1974, the Council of the Haida Nation was faced with the challenge of negotiating Haida Title to Haida Gwaii. And like I think here in the US, we have band councils who have jurisdiction under what in Canada is called the Indian Act. And we knew that that wouldn't be sufficient to negotiate broad territorial title to Haida Gwaii because their jurisdiction came from the Indian Act. And so we formed what was called the Council of the Haida Nation, and its mandate comes from the land and the people. And we created a constitution in those early days that grounded the mandate of the Council of the Haida Nation. That constitution was formally adopted in 2003. And it mandates the Haida Nation to steward the lands and waters of Haida territories on behalf of the Haida Nation and to perpetuate Haida language and culture for future generations. This has proved to be a very successful model in that we weren't limited by federal government mandates for what we could and could not do. It meant we were limited in our funding and we had very limited ability. Much of our efforts in the 70s was all volunteer efforts on the part of Haida citizens. It was a great time for the birth of the Council of the Haida Nation. One of the great mobilizing moments was the protection of Lyle Island, what we called Haida Gwaii. And much of Haida Gwaii was being logged and has been logged. This is a clear cut of Haida Gwaii before clear cutting practices improved. And the elders were very alarmed to hear about our sacred territories being clear-cutted in the way that was proposed under BC's forestry legislation. And so the elders and the people went down to Haida Gwaii and we asserted our Haida laws, we upheld our Haida laws, and we stopped the logging from proceeding. And these are images from those days in 1985. The elders and the warriors of the time fought over who would go on the line first, and the elders won. They said, you always put the elders first, and we are going first. And so they stood on the line. They faced being arrested, but they were willing to do it to protect Haida Gwaii. So here's an image of the elders being escorted to jail. Some of them were escorted by Haida policemen. It was a really incredible time that brought the Haida Nation together. Haida Gwaii, Lyle Island, is in the southern part of Haida Gwaii, but our nation unified. in that people from Masset and the northern part of our islands were all part of the effort to protect Haida Gwaii. And what resulted was the Gaayhllxid Agreement in 1993. And what's really amazing about that agreement is we realized that we would never acknowledge federal government jurisdiction to Haida Gwaii, and they also would never acknowledge Haida jurisdiction to Haida Gwaii. And so we began the agreement with two disagreeing perspectives. We said we own Haida Gwaii, they said they own Haida Gwaii, and then we recognized that despite those differences, we were willing to proceed on our commonalities and to manage Haida Gwaii for future generations as a scientific benchmark. We agreed in that agreement and later management plans to manage the Gaayhllxid area to the highest scientific, environmental, and cultural standards. So it's an incredible agreement. It is a model that is based on consent, which many of us are hearing about now with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Our leaders at the time said that if we didn't give our consent to even build an outhouse in Gaayhllxid, then it couldn't proceed, and that's how the area has been managed since then. It's about 25% of the territory of the Haida Gwaii shown in the map. It's the lower part of Haida Gwaii shown outlined there. At the time, we also designated the surrounding marine spaces as protected, but Canada wasn't then willing to protect that area, so we created the Gaayhllxid National Park Reserve, which protected the land area. That wasn't the end of logging. In 1999, the Council of the Haida Nation challenged the Minister of Forests' jurisdiction due to Haida Title. I was an article student then. I pulled together the evidence for that case. It went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. And the court affirmed that Canada has a duty to not only consult, but to accommodate Aboriginal interests when they have not yet been the subject of litigation or a treaty. And so what that meant for us is that because we had been so far along in articulating what Haida Title is, it meant that we had to be accommodated, not just consulted about decisions. This is a map that shows how we've transformed Haida Gwaii over time. So in the upper corner is a map showing the lands that are federally recognized as Indian reserves. They're little pinpricks on a map. They're 0.16% of Haida Gwaii. That's all we began working with at the start in the 1970s on the part of the Council of the Haida Nation. And then much of the land was allocated to third parties. So 2.8% of the land is fee simple because we are in a remote location. We didn't have to deal with private property interests or large amounts of private property. The areas that are shown in green in that second map are areas that are parks or park reserves. And then all of the red areas were allocated to forest tenures. So much of Haida Gwaii was logged before the 1999 Haida Nation case. After the Haida Nation case, the province replaced the tree farm license. We had to go back to direct action. It led to a land use plan that we co-hosted, and it resulted in the land use plan that is shown on the bottom. And so we ended up protecting 75% of Haida Gwaii through planning how the land would be used. So that's, again, a significant amount. We still haven't negotiated a treaty. We haven't completed any title litigation, but we've protected 75% of our territory. And what I'm here to talk about today is the more recent agreement, this past year, the Haida Title Lands Agreement. And I'll come back to that image shortly. Beginning from 1974, the Haida Nation was really clear that any decisions about our lands had to be managed under Haida law. And so we formed the Constitution of the Haida Nation that I talked about. We operated in principle under it until 2003. We implemented the land use vision that I talked about, and the name of that vision was Gíihlagalgang, and the closest translation of that is respecting Haida Gwaii, and that was in 2005. We then sat down with our elders in 2007 and worked out what we called Haida ethics and values. Really, they're Haida laws, but at the time people were afraid and didn't want to say that they were Haida laws. People think of laws as the criminal code or things that are written down, but not the laws that live in the heart of our elders. And so in 2007, those were fundamental laws that I'll talk about later, and those then were the laws that we operated under in managing Haida Gwaii. We've implemented laws under our health service delivery in the management plan for the Gwaii area that we negotiated 20 years later in 2018. We could have signed off on a management plan earlier, but we insisted on Haida laws being the backbone of the management plan for the Gwaii area. We've since been working on a marine plan in 2015 and in 2019, and I'll talk a little bit about those later. These are the agreements that we've worked through, the 1993 Gwaii Agreement, the Kunstago Kunstaya Reconciliation Protocol, and that was an agreement that we negotiated with the province of British Columbia. The Haida translation of that name is the beginning. So in that agreement, the province recognized that Haida had title and that we would work together to manage the areas. It wasn't a complete recognition of title, so we kept pursuing that, and it led to the Changing Tide Agreement that we finally signed this year with the province of British Columbia. It is a significant agreement in that the province recognizes and affirms Haida title to Haida Gwaii. This doesn't happen in Canada. It doesn't happen in many countries, in fact, where the state recognizes title without being forced to do so through negotiations and litigation. And the treaty process in British Columbia put a cap of 15% of a nation's territory could be the subject of a treaty, and we're at 100% with this agreement. So we have recognition of title to 100% of the lands of Haida Gwaii, as well as the foreshore, which is really important for the species that we live on in Haida Gwaii. Now, just to briefly explain that agreement, the important thing about that agreement is, and an important part of the negotiations, is that that agreement has constitutional force. It's protected under the Constitution of Canada, which gives it it's like a super right in Canada. So it's a great step forward. It recognizes that we will have jurisdiction on Haida Gwaii, and that that jurisdiction will be under our inherent title and our inherent Haida laws. We, on our part, many, many years ago at the beginning, when we were exploring what reconciliation means at Lyle Island, we stood on the line and we looked at the loggers on the other side of the line and realized that our children were growing up together and that we had to find a way forward, and we started our efforts at reconciliation, and we negotiated with them that we would never displace the private property holders of their homes. Once we got Haida title, we signed protocol agreements with all the local communities, and they supported us in the Haida Nation case that went to the Supreme Court of Canada. The province tried to say, we're here to protect all the citizens of this province, and those citizens said, we have greater trust that the Haida Nation will protect our interests than the province of British Columbia. And that was really important at the Supreme Court of Canada. And so from those very early days in the 1980s, we agreed under this agreement to respect those fee simple ownership. And again, that's a long-standing principle that we've followed as part of the formation of the Haida Nation. We also agreed that for now, the interests of the two band councils on Haida Gwaii would remain in place, so they'll still be functioning under the Indian Act until we work amongst ourselves how the jurisdiction will be exercised as between us. We also flagged the need to look at the larger fee simple interests, so logging companies that have fee simple title or fishing lodges. Those are the things we still need to address, and we agreed that we'd look at those in the coming years. It is the first agreement in Canada to recognize Aboriginal title at this scale. It's our whole territory. No litigation has recognized title for a nation's whole territory, and no negotiated agreements or treaties have done that. It is a great step forward, and it's a great step in the right direction. We also realize that this cannot occur overnight, so we've set out a 2-year transition period when we would work through how to implement the agreement. So really, it's a bare recognition. The province is saying, I recognize that you have Haida title. Now let's work out how these jurisdictions will work together, what areas you will solely manage and what areas the province will manage. We also wanted to leave time for the Government of Canada to be a part of the agreement, and we're hoping that in the coming weeks ahead, we'll negotiate and conclude an agreement with the Government of Canada as well. This agreement is important in that it will not require the Haida Nation to surrender our rights, to change our rights, to modify them. It doesn't require us to stand down our Aboriginal title litigation, which we're proceeding quickly to a trial date starting on May the 4th of 2026. So we've got this massive title litigation proceeding forward, and the agreement doesn't require us to stand that litigation down. Really, this agreement is a stepping stone all along the long journey that we've taken to protect Haida Gwaii for the present Haida citizens and future generations of Haida. Now, here's the thing that I think many people would love to be in this position of defining what is title to you, what is Tlingit title, what is Tsimshian title, what is the title of the Indigenous peoples in the world, and what are our laws that will inform our title. So that's where we are right now, having to define what Haida title means, how we will implement it, what our rights will be. We also are in the great position of continuing to implement Haida title. We've been doing that since CHN, the Council of Haida Nation, was formed in 1974. And we're also continuing to implement our laws over the lands and waters of Haida Gwaii. So our next steps are crucial, and I want to focus the rest of the presentation on that and where we're beginning that work of defining what is Haida title and what are Haida laws. Of course, we have to begin. As any great anthropologist would know, we begin by looking at the worldview of the Haida Nation. And so we've occupied Haida Gwaii since at least 12,200 years before present. That's what the archaeologists have found. Our oral histories go further back, but that's the evidence that we have. We have a long relationship with Haida Gwaii, and Haida Gwaii must be the wellspring from which our laws will come. We have to turn to Haida Gwaii to understand our laws. We also have to understand our relationship with the supernatural beings of Haida Gwaii, because they illustrate in our narratives the deep interconnections that they hold, and they illustrate with our culture, ceremonies, worldview, language, territory, and stories. I'm feeling a little bit like the person in the Wizard of Oz right now. Or maybe it's emphasizing some of my words. The land and sea and beings of the land and sea will be the primary sources of Haida law. Now, I'll begin with one of the early origin stories, early origin narratives of the Haida Nation. We have an epic Raven traveling series where Raven creates the world as we know it today. And in one of the stories, there's a significant moment where Raven circled what would become Haida Gwaii, and Raven saw near an instance, which is the southwestern tip of Haida Gwaii, Raven saw a reef, and there were supernatural beings heaped on that reef. They didn't have form. It was as if they didn't have a backbone. The strongest ones were holding on to the reef, and the weaker ones were holding on to the stronger ones, trying to get a foothold, something to hold on to. And I think that I've interpreted this narrative to mean that, to illustrate a fundamental law of the Haida Nation, that we are nothing without the land. The land and ocean define who we are, and as Gujau, the previous president, Gdansk, has said many, many times, if the land and sea change, we change. So this story tells us about the importance of the land, that we will not have backbones, we won't have structure without the land. And then there's an important story that Gwaganut, Diane Brown, often tells. She's my Haida Kill, Haida language teacher. And she said, in the beginning of time, not this lifetime, but the first time we ever came as a people to Haida Gwaii, we came out of the air. This was told to me by Nung Kingai Yuan's James Young. So we became people from the air, and then for some reason we all disappeared. The second time we came out of the earth, and again we disappeared. The third time we came out of the ocean, as many of our legends in many different forms. There were those at Naikun that came out of the clamshell. There are those that were on the reef with Skulujat, foam woman, and they came out onto the earth from that reef. And there were many, many spots all over Haida Gwaii that we can point to and say, this is where our ancestors came out of the ocean. That idea of the ties to the ocean is embodied in the Haida word for killer whales or orcas. It shares the same root word. Skana shares the same root word as the word for supernatural beings, which is Haida Gwaii, and it also shares the same root word for Skaga, which is shaman in Haida Gíihlagalgang. Haida Gwaii is critical habitat for the northern resident orcas, and in fact, the primary form of the supernatural beings when they come into the human realm is as an orca. They put on the skin of a killer whale and they appear in our realm as killer whales. In our Raven traveling narratives, we learned that we would journey down into the undersea world, in the undersea realm, and we got fire from the supernatural beings there. We also learned the sacred cedar bark ceremonies from the supernatural beings, and we learned how to carve the totem poles that appear around us from the supernatural beings that lived in the ocean realm. So we're intimately connected to the ocean realm. The Haida Nation has worked on this series of maps called the Haida Ocean and Way of Life map, and in it we show all the species from the oceans that we've harvested. We also include images of supernatural beings that appear in certain spots in the landscape of Haida Gwaii, because our use of Haida Gwaii is tied to those supernatural beings. They taught us where to gather certain species, and it's a beautiful map. This is just a close-up of that map. We learned how to harvest from the supernatural beings. They taught us important lessons, laws, and technologies about how to catch seafood from the oceans. This all came from the supernatural beings. The greatest supernatural being in the oceans is called Tangwan, the one in the sea. And Tangwan lives in the deepest part of the ocean, deeper than the towns of the ocean people, in a town called Gíihlagalgang. Tangwan owns the black cod or the sablefish, and that is one of the primary protein sources on Haida Gwaii. We don't have a terrestrial game like you have here, so we depended on the oceans for all of our existence. And sablefish is rich in oil and was the primary sources of our sustenance. We believe that everything that we throw into the ocean goes right into the home of Tangwan, so we really have to be careful how we treat the oceans. When we go down into the ocean realm, the villages of the ocean and people appear just like these villages. When we went down into the land of Tangwan, we went into a longhouse like this. The sacred cedar bark rings were hanging in the corner, the whistles. We learned that in a village much like this in the undersea world. Every species in the ocean is called a people, so the salmon people, the black cod people, the cod people, they're all people of their own right, and when they come into our realm, they're allowing us to harvest them and put on their skins so that we can continue to exist in this world. We have throughout Haida Gwaii these beautiful supernatural beings, some of which I depicted in my book Out of Concealment, and they teach us how to harvest from the area. So we believe that there is Chow Jade, low tide woman, who lives in the intertidal realm, and she takes care of all the shellfish and the other beings in the intertidal area. We must get her permission before she lowers the tides so that we can harvest from the area that she caretakes. She teaches us that the intertidal area is a feminine realm that we must steward. She teaches us stewardship of the intertidal area. Similarly, at the head of every creek is a Gaayhllxid, a creek woman, and she takes care of all the salmon and trout that return to that river and that stream. Like low tide woman, she teaches us about the spirit of the salmon and the trout and the need to show Yahda, or respect, before taking the salmon and the trout. I mentioned that all of the beings are people of their own right, and one of the most important are Chinu Haida, or salmon people. And they've nourished ecosystems here in southeast Alaska and in Haida Gwaii and throughout the Pacific Northwest. And our elders have told us that they're creatures of the forest. They're not creatures of the ocean. They're creatures of the forest. They're born there and they die there. All 7 species of salmon are present in Haida Gwaii, and they've nourished Haida peoples physically, spiritually, and culturally since they first made their appearance on Haida Gwaii. They appear many, many times in the Haida narrative, so they have what we call a high profile in those narratives. Haida laws governing fishing for salmon are performance-based. They're enacted through teaching how to process the salmon to the youth, through bringing out that food in potlatches and feasts. They're performance-based. So we learn law when we process the salmon with the next generation, and we learn how to coexist through fishing and through processing and preserving salmon. So we need to always come back to our narratives. They're really important to finding our laws, Indigenous laws. We need to always come back and revisit them. We'll always find new meanings. That's why the elders tell us the stories over and over again, because every time we hear them, we'll learn something different. The Haida creation narratives that I shared earlier, they don't just teach us the importance of the land, but they teach us about the importance of the oceans. As I said, they reveal that the Haida Nation is born from the ocean, and this is contained in the preamble to the Haida Constitution, where we say we owe our existence to Haida Gwaii. So that includes the oceans. And so therefore, oceans are a key mandate of the Council of the Haida Nation. They're a key mandate in our future negotiations, as well as the Aboriginal title case that is looming and proceeding forward in Canada's courts. I've included here a slide of the Haida territory as contained in the Haida Title litigation. It's a large area beyond Canada's jurisdiction. We're collaboratively managing Gwaii Seamount. The Haida name for that is Gíihlagalgang, or supernatural being looking outward. It's an underwater volcano, and when the tide goes down, you can see the supernatural being, and that's why it's looking outwards. So there are many seamounts like that that are actually supernatural beings. That we believe that they're supernatural beings. In the epic Raven traveling stories, these supernatural beings ended up turning into mountains and turning into reefs and turning into points and volcanic mountains like the Gíihlagalgang, the Gwaii Seamount. Again, here's the territory that the province of British Columbia has recognized. They've recognized the foreshore because that's part of their jurisdiction under Canada's constitution, and we're hoping to get greater recognition of the oceans in our negotiations with the Government of Canada. Our marine planning team is extremely busy. I'm always so proud of the work that they do. They've negotiated numerous marine plans. They've negotiated with a number of nations, marine protected areas in the Haida Strait, working together with many Indigenous nations in the province of British Columbia. Under the Gaayhllxid agreement, we negotiated in the upper right corner areas that are strictly protected under Haida law, areas that are important rearing grounds for old cod and different species like that that are so important. The marine team is dealing with introduced species like green crab. We've harvested millions of green crab from our territories, and they're taking over the habitat of Dungeness crab and crabs that are important to Haida culture. We've also been working on negotiating ocean traffic zones around Haida Gwaii to protect the territory from any oil spills and things like that. I mentioned the Haida laws that are contained in the Marine Plan. So going back to the 2007 meeting with the Haida elders, they negotiated these laws that govern every management plan. We also aligned them with ecosystem-based management principles so that the province of British Columbia and Canada would understand them better. So we've tied them together, and I've included here the Haida Kill and the Hot Kill translations of those laws. They are respect for all beings, interconnectedness, responsibility, seeking wise counsel, giving and receiving or reciprocity, working together or collaborative management, and balance. I'll talk a bit about those laws. One of the most important, we believe, is interconnectedness. All of the narratives tell us about what we do to the ocean affects the land, and what we do to the land affects the ocean. And so we're the first area in the world to manage from mountaintop to seafloor in the Gaayhllxid National Park Reserve because of this key law contained in Haida culture. We find that water connects everything. The ocean and the streams connect the water and Haida culture to everything in the islands of Haida Gwaii. We've worked on, like many nations, in articulating a seasonal round. The oceans are a year-round source of protein because we don't have a lot of terrestrial game, and we harvest about 150 marine species around the 150 islands of Haida Gwaii. We also harvest 150 plants from the islands of Haida Gwaii. And the elders have told us, Gíihlagalgang, our food is our medicine. So I'll quickly share some of the medicines from the ocean, some of the more important ones to the elders. Gudingai, or sea urchin, it's a beloved tradition to go and harvest sea urchin in low tide places like Waihanas. They're shared with and highly treasured with elders. When my mother was in her dying days, she said if I could just have one gudingai, then I could die. And I didn't know whether to give it to her. But many people say that. They just want to have one more taste of gudingai. People in Southeast Alaska are, of course, really love inang, haidare, herring people, and gao, herring spawn on kelp. We love gao in Haida Gwaii, and it's a beautiful, beautiful place to go to harvest. Although the abundance is really down, has come down quite a bit. We successfully got an injunction to prevent the opening of that fishery in 2017 because we just couldn't have any more fishing of the herring if we were going to have gao going forward. Gaayhllxid, Haida Gwaii, northern abalone people, they were once plentiful from Alaska to Baja. It was a staple of the Haida diet. Our elders told us they ate it like bread. It was like bread before we had bread introduced. Unfortunately, the fishery has been closed since 1990, and it's been listed as threatened since 2000. So eating abalone is a rare event, and also many elders say if I could just have some Gaayhllxid, then I could leave this world. So one of the laws was responsibilities, and that's what we've done, is exercise our responsibilities to protect this land, to ensure it remains intact through the efforts of Lyle Island and Haida Gwaii. At a critical moment in the efforts to protect Lyle Island, we faced an injunction from the province of British Columbia and erected this house. You'll hear from Robert Davidson tomorrow, and he won't tell you, though, that he was the president of the Vancouver Local and worked in raising funds for this effort to protect Waihanas. And he provided this design for the looking around blinking house at Lyle Island that we erected as an act of our sovereignty to the southern part of Haida Gwaii. The other image is the action that a peaceful information campaign that we did after the province replaced the license that we won at the Supreme Court of Canada to give more information about the extent of logging and to bring in the local communities about the need to protect the forests of Haida Gwaii. I'm worried about running out of time. Quickly, I'll leave this here for you to read. This is a beautiful quote from Gíihlagalgang. He was the president at the time of the Lyle Island movement, Miles Richardson, and it's from the book Upholding the Law, Haida Gwaii, and I recommend that book to you. It contains many of the wisdom of the elders who stood on the line and were willing to be arrested at Lyle Island. Now, as I said, a key law of the Haida Nation is lagura kantlans, or responsibility. And I was so curious to find out that word translates literally as you on it, chest leaning on. And I didn't understand why responsibility would have that translation. And I realized that it comes from an ancient narrative about the creation of Haida Gwaii. And at the beginning of time, all the supernatural beings before humans came to Haida Gwaii were battling, and they were battling for the privilege of who would hold up Haida Gwaii. They all wanted that privilege. So unlike Atlas, where he was the loser and he had to hold up the world, in Haida Gwaii, the winner had the privilege of holding up Haida Gwaii. And so Gíihlagalgang is the supernatural being that won that battle, and he is holding up Haida Gwaii with a cedar tree pole on his chest. And so we learn from that early narrative that we lovingly take on the responsibility to protect Haida Gwaii. We don't feel that we're obligated to protect Haida Gwaii. We lovingly take on that responsibility. And so I've worked to create what that image would look like, and this is an image of Haida Gwaii balanced on that cedar pole. Gíihlagalgang is shown on the ocean floor, up holding Haida Gwaii and balancing Haida Gwaii which teaches us that balance is really important, finding balance with all of human activities over the lands and waters of Haida Gwaii. You'll see in the undersea world the longhouses of the supernatural beings. You'll see the supernatural beings coming into the human realm, appearing as killer whales. This image has stuck in my head about the need to willingly take on the responsibility to caretake our territory. Another really important law comes from my father's father, Chief Gíihlagalgang Lewis Collinson, and he made a beautiful speech in 1969. And he said, people are like trees, and groups of people are like the forests. While the forests are composed of many different kinds of trees, these trees intertwine their roots so strongly that it is impossible for the strongest winds which blow on our islands to uproot the forests. For each tree strengthens its neighbor, and their roots are inextricably entwined. In the same way, the people of our islands, composed of members of nations and races from all over the world, are beginning to intertwine their roots so strongly that no troubles will affect them. Just as one tree standing alone would soon be destroyed by the first strong wind which came along, so it is impossible for any person, any family, or any community to stand alone against the troubles of this world. And so from this speech came the Council of the Haida Nation and the mandate to work with the local communities to get the necessary support to lead us to the Rising Tide Agreement. It's a beautiful speech that you'll find some of his beautiful language in the preamble to the Constitution of the Haida Nation. The overarching law of the Haida Nation is Gíihlagalgang, and drawing from Chief Gíihlagalang's speech, I drew upon his speech for my Master of Laws thesis, and the name of the thesis is the Gíihlagalgang Forest Legal Tradition. So I recognize that all the trees create the forest, and that it's a complex ecosystem that contain more than trees and many life forms, and we need to plan for all of those life forms in our management. And so all the laws, when they come together, they form Gíihlagalgang, the Gíihlagalgang legal tradition of the Haida Nation. And these legal traditions must be rooted in our culture like the trees are rooted in their culture, and when we do that, they contribute to the renewal and resurgence of laws and culture. And so this is an illustration of the framework that I developed in my Master of Laws thesis that contains all of the laws that I talked about earlier, and it is tied to the biological functions of the tree. And the idea was that it is not for lawyers, including me, to say what the laws of the Haida Nation are. It must be the elders. And elders don't think in terms of case briefs. They don't think like lawyers. They think about gathering things from the ocean and the sea. And so likewise, this framework is intended for the elders to gather together the laws that talk about balance, to gather the laws that talk about reciprocity and gender and authority, and laws that protect the people. They gather together the laws that talk about intergenerational knowledge and sharing, and about Gíihlagalgang. And so this is the framework that the Haida Nation is using to gather our laws together so that we'll have our laws in place to manage and define Haida Title. I've also included an image of my illustration of Cedar Sister, because we believe that she is an ancient sister that takes care of everything we need, including everything around us in this beautiful house today. And from that, we've received a grant from the Law Foundation of British Columbia, a $1.2 million grant, to look at the Haida laws and define them for the Haida Nation. And we're engaged in place-based landing. We're place-based learning with elders and youth. We're analyzing all of the oral narratives and all of the previous testimonies of the Haida Nation to articulate the laws and bring it back to the community. One of the famous scholars in Canada is John Burroughs, and he says, Indigenous laws may be regarded as literally being written on the earth. And that's why we're going out on the land and harvesting and learning on the land, because that's where our laws are written. And so some of the projects we've done over the last 2 years include going out and harvesting spruce root with Dolores Churchill and her family, and learning about the laws of how to gather spruce root and what those laws mean for managing the forest. We also attended and documented the memorial potlatch of Jane Kristovich, Dolores Churchill's sister, in October of 2023, and documented the laws that were shared in that potlatch. We attended a potlatch in November of 2023 of the Gittins, the Eagles of Skidegate, and how do you look at dispute resolution and how do you work through a potlatch? And those laws are part of the basket that we're developing in the Haida Laws Project. We also contributed a food harvesting and cooking workshop with the last Haida language conference in January of 2024. That was a beautiful time to come together with the elders and learn about cooking and the laws that come from cooking. Again, laws are in everything around us, but people don't think of them as laws, and this project is changing our mindsets so that we can recognize the laws that we need to carry forward for future generations. We recently did a beautiful chitin harvest in the northern part of Haida Gwaii and learned about the laws for how much to take, how you respectfully take chitin, how you cook it, how you process it. In August of 2023, we went down into Gaayhllxid and did intertidal harvesting for a few days. Gaayhllxid is like God's country. It's so beautiful, so it was wonderful to go down there and spend time with Waganot and generations of Haida people to harvest Gaayhllxid, abalone, and many other species. She really emphasizes the importance of feeding the spirits, so at every place we went to, we fed the spirits because they haven't been fed for a long time in these remote areas of the territory. We stayed at Hot Springs, a beautiful place in the southern part of Gaayhllxid for that trip. We're standing in front of a old totem pole in my village of Skinans here. There are 13 potlatch rings on this pole, and it's one of the last standing poles from the 1800s in the southern part of Haida Gwaii. We recognize that youth have an integral role in articulating our laws. It's not just elders, but the youth must learn from the elders, and that is all contained in the idea of Hanji, or hunts in Hatkil. It is reincarnation or rebirth. So often we receive our names if elders recognize that you have a Hanji of someone else. You can't pass that name on if it comes from another clan, but you can carry that name throughout your lifetime. The memories of Hanji, of your reincarnation, are strongest when you're younger, and so the youth will carry forward the lessons for the future, and they're the ones that will live with what we decide today, so they'll be an important part of our articulating the Haida laws. So in my Cedar Sister framework, I recognize that when a tree grows, it starts as a sapling, and then it builds wood on it, and so the outer layers are like the youth that rely upon the core of the tree, which is the elders. And so our laws grow like that as the youth come and recognize what our laws are. So in conclusion, our journey in the Rising Tide Agreement is to arrive at reconciliation with oceans. They define who we are, they define our identity, they define our laws. Our identity is linked to marine spaces and marine species. And we've kept this connection despite colonial legislation that has dispossessed Indigenous peoples of fisheries. And that dispossession has replaced how we see the world. It's displaced how we manage the species, but we're back and we're managing those species according to our laws. The challenges, of course, are federal and provincial recognition of title. This is a piece that I did talking about Indigenous title to spaces. Title to oceans everywhere around the world is far behind recognition of title to land. So it's a really important part of the next negotiation stages and of the title litigation. But it's also important when we look at the resurgence of ocean law, when we focus on what are the laws that are relevant to ocean spaces. And so that's part of what we're looking at in the Haida Laws Project, and how seafood is brought into the feast hall and how that ties to our laws and how we articulate who we are. I'm also really privileged to have received a grant from Canada Council for the Arts to create a 21-minute film about the resurgence of Haida sailmaking. And Jacques Clow, Paula Vernell, is the granddaughter to Dolores Churchill, and she's creating the first sail made out of cedar bark, returning back to our old ways and bringing us back out into ocean spaces. I see that sail as a way to reassert our use and occupation of ocean spaces. One of the reports filed in the Haida Title case from Canada's experts is that we didn't navigate as Indigenous peoples. We didn't navigate like the Polynesians might have. We didn't go very far. The weather was horrible like it is today with rain and wind, so we didn't ever go out on the oceans. And that's actually what they're saying in the litigation. And so this project will say, no, we remember how to navigate, and we know how to use sails to take us far into ocean spaces. So my concluding comment is that we all have a collective responsibility to take care of our territories. We have a responsibility to contribute to developing equitable and just solutions to both responsible management and regulation of oceans, and towards dealing with climate change, which is really impacting the oceans around us. The Haida worldview, land, oceans, and all beings in the land and sea are all embraced in this responsibility. The greatest supernatural being, Tangwan, the one in the sea that I spoke about, tells us again, everything put into the ocean goes into the home of Tangwan. But like Gíihlagalgang, the being who holds up Haida Gwaii, we all hold the responsibility to hold up the earth. As Indigenous peoples, we all hold responsibilities to contribute to the resurgence of our languages, our cultures, our artistic practices, and all that makes us who we are. Thank you. Hawa. Hawa.
Well, first of all, I want to congratulate you and thank you for all of your years of work. We in Alaska know somewhat a little bit about you, and we're always envious of the progress that you guys are making. And I know that you personally have been working, very diligently, on these issues for years. I have a couple of questions, but first I want to comment that it's really neat to see the interrelationship between, the worldview, the spiritual dimensions, and how you're pushing for that interrelationship in the development, formation of laws, as I understand it. Yes. And we dream about that here, but I don't think we've formulated or have gone as far as you have. So that's really exciting. I think it's a great model for us to look at. When you say, well, first of all, the Canadian government has recognized your Aboriginal title.
The BC government has.
The BC government has.
The government hasn't, but we hope they will in the next week or so.
Okay, and then you have to go a next step where you transform, or this Aboriginal title is changed into Haida title?
Yeah, so we have to implement the agreement. It's a bare recognition of our title and rights, but now we need to say, how does that title impact land management? How does it impact management of oceans and land spaces?
So in terms of governance, are you like a nation, a recognized government?
That's a great question. Last year, the province of British Columbia and the Haida and the government of Canada formally recognized the Council of the Haida Nation as a government. Because until then, we started in 1974 as a grassroots organization. We funneled our money through a provincial society. We had no legal recognition. Now we are recognized as a government, and that again is our big work, is how will we govern? How do we develop our governance structures so that we can effectively manage Haida Gwaii?
And then the next question has to do with revenues. How are your revenues for all the management still coming from BC, or is that something internally developed?
Yeah, so when we brought I raised a lot of money at the beginning to bring the Haida Nation case to the Supreme Court of Canada because we didn't have money. And then that led to revenue sharing agreements between the province of British Columbia and the Haida, and that allowed us to bootstrap to bring forward these initiatives that I've been speaking about. This agreement will end up ultimately resulting in larger payments that will help govern, that will help ground the governance that we need to going forward. We've accessed carbon credits. That has been a big help in getting us to this date as well. But we really have a lot of work to do in looking at transfer payments and all those things that, that any province or territory must deal with when they step into power.
Will it be perpetual payments, or is it like a one-time?
Yeah, and we hope it will be perpetual. So in Canada, there is a treaty model where it's a final agreement, you get payment, that's it. But then those nations are left without it. They don't have enough money to manage going forward. And we didn't negotiate under that framework, the comprehensive claims process. Instead, we push for this reconciliation approach, which emphasizes our ongoing relationships so that we'll continue to receive ongoing funding.
I have a lot more questions, but I better not.
Hello. I gotta say a few words and commend you on the work you're doing. There's a man by the name of Gíihlagalgang, and the caretaker of the Shungu KD, and the man that carries that name now is standing in the corner. He made a comment some time ago, and he asked the audience if they could hear it. Do you hear it? Do you hear the creatures underneath the water crying? And then he asks, who's going to speak for them? And that's what I see you doing, is speaking for the creatures that we hold dear to our, to ourselves, and we depend on for subsistence. We look, now we're being surrounded by this thing called mining, and we have concerns on the Canadian mines that are happening, and we feel like we're just going to swim into the mouth of the sea monster because of the big money that we have to go up against. Does the Haida Gwaii have any concerns, or are they going to push forward against giving them more regulations? That's what I think I'm pretty sure I see you going to do.
Yeah. Mining is always important to consider. There is a proposed gold mine in the heartland of the Yahkun River, which is the food harvesting area of the northern Haida people, that is proposed yet again, and every 10, 20 years it keeps coming up. So we'll have to deal with that going forward. I am representing the BC Human Rights Commissioner in litigation challenging the BC mining legislation for failing to uphold UNDRIP. That case went to the BC Supreme Court. It's going to the Court of Appeal in January of next year, so we're hoping that we'll get guidance that mining legislation, just like the forestry legislation, can't just proceed forward as if the Indigenous peoples are not there. Our consent must be obtained, and we hope that that will help give some clarity in the mining industry and proposed initiatives.
We have an online question. What is the difference between the title agreement signed this year and the trial coming up in 2026?
That is a great question. When we signed the agreement, a lot of people thought that's the end of litigation, but it's not, because we still have to implement. Everything depends on implement. So there's a 2-year period. It's tied to when our trial date starts. So it's sort of like saying, I recognize you, but I'm not going to give you your rights yet. And the agreement is not about giving rights, but we need to actually ensure that those rights are protected in the land and in the sea. So that's the work of implementing. And because we believe that Canada and BC will not look at past compensation, that's their position in negotiations, and because they will not deal with ocean spaces, that the title case, right now it includes land and sea, compensation, everything, that it may get shaved down to deal only with marine spaces if we get through the implementation in the next 2 years. So it still will proceed. We might only look at title to marine spaces and marine species. And the second phase of the trial is dealing with the millions of dollars that are owed to the Haida people for the illegal taking of resources before title was recognized.
That was my next question I had was, how do you generate income to pay for all of your structures, your programs? Even, I know your tourism, you control it, correct? The number of ships, boats that come in is controlled, is that correct?
So dealing with your last question, yes, through the Gaayhllxid agreement, that's the area where most of the tourism goes. It was contained under the management plan that we finally signed in 2018, Canada and BC. So we limit, it's one of the best managed national parks in the reserve because we limit the visitors that are on the land at any given time. As for the question of money, I'm not part of that, so I feel like I can't speak. I just go to court or whatever it is. So, but certainly that will be a part of the negotiations going forward. We can't manage without funds to do so.
Hi, first I just want to say thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. I have a question pertaining to the land use planning of the Haida Gwaii territory. So with the 2010 land use plan, and then as well as being recognized as a federal, or being recognized as a government structure, does that give you jurisdiction over all future land use planning of the Haida Gwaii territory, or do you still have to work within the federal government and the federal framework for how you are able to manage your land and resources?
Yeah, so the federal government only has jurisdiction over reserves, so 0.16% of Haida Gwaii, and the Gaayhllxid area because it's a national park reserve. The rest of it, BC has jurisdiction over the lands. But because we have title recognition, we need to sort out between the Haida Nation and BC who will have jurisdiction over what, and that's the work of implementation. But the idea is that all those protected areas that I showed will certainly be subject to Haida law. The whole land base will be subject to Haida law, so things will now be managed more sustainably, and there'll be better controls in place to ensure that the trees and the cedar trees remain for future generations.
Thank you.
Hi. I'm wondering how you are going to claim the use of the ocean all the way out to the international border. Is that something you have to demonstrate, or are you using cultural arguments that you were able to traverse that area, and how is that working?
So in the statement of claim, which is the document that launched the title case, we claim that full territory that I showed. But then we also say that for the purposes of the litigation, we're only going up to the edge of Canada's jurisdiction, because Canada's courts don't have a jurisdiction to grant beyond that. But we maintain that beyond, up to that line is under Haida title and Haida jurisdiction. But the title case is only going up to the edge of Canada's jurisdiction, the 200-mile limit.
Thank you. Does that mean there can't be any commercial fishing on that territory, on your territory?
Well, the limits of commercial fishing will need to be worked through. So we came up with the 2018 management plan for Gaayhllxid, and commercial fishing was allowed in some areas, but many areas were no-take zones where fishing was not allowed. So we'll probably go through a similar process to the rest of the islands. And I think it comes back to the Haida word of balance. And I saw that just even seeing my father as a fisherman. My father would drive down the road and he couldn't run over a furry caterpillar. But yet on his boat, he could club that salmon and kill it and throw it aboard. So, you know, we have this precarious balance that we walk as Indigenous peoples. And it's finding that beautiful balance that will allow us to continue to exist. That is the hard work that we willingly assume.
Hi, thanks so much for sharing your successes. I know that the U.S. government has a habit of like breaking tribal government laws or just being lenient with those who do break it. Do you have that same experience with the BC government or those who break Haida laws?
I hope that's a thing of the past. The land use plan agreement, we created a collaborative management body, and we worked through consensus decisions. I think it was about 90% of the development decisions. But the 10%, if we didn't reach agreement, the province proceeded anyway and approved the permits. And so those contentious small percentage really pushed us to go forward to get more than that, to get consent over the whole territory. And it led to injunctions, it led to litigation, direct action, all of those things, because we didn't reach consensus on those last few areas. So we hope that now that's the thing of the past, and that we'll be able to work through those decisions in a better way. I think we're out of time.
Well, final chance for question and answer. Thank you very much, Terri-Lynn, for presenting very knowledgeable and presentation, and we're just so blessed that you spent this hour with us. Our next lecture will be tomorrow with Robert Davidson on creating spaces in Haida art. Thank you for joining.
Thank you all. Hawa.